I can't believe it's been 19 years since that terrible day, September 11th, 2001. It was such a beautiful morning, so clear and crisp and sunny, and then murder on a horrific scale, and then murder again, and then again and again. A black swan, they called it, something people couldn't imagine before, so it was never contemplated. I mean, there had been airplanes hijacked before, for sure. It was the go-to terrorist move by Muslim extremists, but it was usually as a threat to get some prisoners released, or else they blow up the plane, or get a cash payment. Sometimes the planes were blown up, but using a full passenger plane as a massive weapon itself, well, that was new. Thousands of lives were lost that day, thousands more in the wars to come, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and then ripple wars, so many other places. America is almost completely out of the Middle East now. Has much changed? Is Afghanistan free now? Is Iraq a blossoming democracy now? What came of all that blood and treasure spent in those countries, including Canadians in Afghanistan? Iraq is the plaything of Iran. Syria is run by Russia and Iran. Libya is a failed state with open-air slave markets and millions of migrants, including hundreds, maybe thousands of terrorists amongst them, have just simply walked into Europe. Was it all worth it? I don't know. The West had to flatten the terrorist groups attacking us: Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, other offshoots, Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not sure if a land war and occupation was the right prescription. Afghanistan is not like Italy or Greece, with histories and traditions and cultures of liberal democracy. Did we think there was some Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or Sir John A. Macdonald just waiting in the wings? And to me, the craziest part is that while we sent so many young men and women over there to die, the theory being it's better to fight the bad guys over there than at home, well, we opened up the borders to mass immigration from those very same terrorist-infested countries. Now, of course, there are peaceful people fleeing from those places. I mentioned already the Christian minority in Iraq that has almost completely fled, but neither Canada nor America, and certainly not Europe, distinguish between the wolves and the lambs. It would be like taking millions of refugees from Germany in 1942. Okay, refugees, fine. Migrants, are you taking Jews and others fleeing the Holocaust where they would be victims, or are you taking Nazis too? Are you taking the wolves, or are you taking the lambs? You might recall that I went to Germany a few years ago and I interviewed a Yazidi woman, a refugee from Iraq, who was a rape slave to ISIS terrorists. She fled to Germany as a refugee, but so did her ISIS tormentors. In fact, once she was in Germany in an absorption center, she had to flee and go to a nunnery to get away from the terrorists in Germany who had come with her as refugees. This was common. I met another guy on the street, just on the street, in Cologne, Germany. A Yazidi refugee, when I asked him a question, he said he didn't want to answer with other men around. They were Muslim. He actually was not. He was Yazidi. He wanted to move away from the Muslim men because if his friends knew he was a Yazidi, they would hurt him in Germany.
Gibt Kurdisch Yazidi. Alle Kurdisch Yazidi.
Yazidi.
You're Yazidi.
Yes. Kommen Sie uns in eine Ecke, weil es so.
Sure. Wir können nicht direkt sagen, wir sind Yazidi, ist ganz schlimm, wenn sagen wir sind Yazidi. Wenn eine islamische hört, sagen wir sind Yazidi, die sagen, wir sind Kafir, wir sind ganz, ganz schlimm. Deswegen, es gibt hier auch viele Muslime, wir können nicht so direkt.
So I don't think we built Afghanistan and Iraq into liberal democracies, and I don't think we did a good job of keeping Islamic extremism out of our countries. In fact, in Canada at least, the Muslim population has tripled through immigration since 9/11. But if that were liberal, progressive, democratic Muslims who want to live with the separation of mosque and state, well, that could be a good thing, a good building block for Canada. But we simply didn't and don't distinguish between moderate Muslims and Islamists. We don't even ask. In fact, most immigrants to Canada don't even have an in-person interview. So we didn't lift up the drawbridge. That battle I showed you in Germany, it's here in Canada too. Former rape slaves, refugees to Canada, have encountered their ISIS rapists on the bus here in Canada. So I don't think we're safer, certainly not from our open borders immigration, neither from the fetishization of Islamophobia, which has turned one religion and one religion only exempt from scrutiny or criticism. When I published the Danish cartoons of Mohammed back in 2006, most media, even the CBC, supported my freedom to do it. Today, most media would not only oppose it, they wouldn't feel the need to debate it. They would just simply call for my arrest. Ironically, it has been Trump who has brought the first twinkle of peace to the Middle East, not through wars and not through pressuring Israel into making ridiculous concessions to terrorist groups who surely have no interest in keeping a peace deal, but making a real peace deal, peace for peace, starting with the most moderate Arab countries, the UAE last month, and now Bahrain just today. Real peace deals, not giving terrorist groups a veto. No wonder the media is so silent on it. It is a Trump success and a repudiation of the peace process of the past 50 years. I see the generals are all out to get Trump, claiming he hates the troops. I think it's pretty clear he doesn't. But the troops and the generals aren't the same thing. It's like police versus police brass. You know, rank and file versus the bosses. The generals love wars. Trump hasn't given them any. First president in decades to do that. Trump's bringing home troops. Maybe that's not good for the arms business, although Trump has built up the military again. But back to 9/11, I think we've already forgotten its lessons. We've forgotten the day. We've forgotten the price we paid for freedoms. We see that again as we so easily give up our freedom because of a pandemic panic. Giving up freedoms that we wouldn't if some foreign tyrant demanded we do so, but we're happy to give up all freedoms because some domestic politician says it's for our health or for the children or whatever. You know, I was invited to give a speech at Ground Zero 9 years ago. I found a video of it. Pamela Geller had invited me. It's a big rally right there, Lower Manhattan. Here, take a look at this video. I was younger then, obviously. My message still stands. What do you think of this?
Thank you, Pamela. Hello. It's an honor to be in New York, standing in solidarity with this city and its resilient and courageous people. I'm a Canadian, so permit me to explain why I'm here. 9/11 was an attack on New York and other American places, but among the murder victims that day were 24 Canadians. But the real target of the terrorists was the culture of freedom that America symbolizes and America's leading role in the world. That culture of freedom is shared and loved by people in every country and is a lighthouse of hope to millions living in the darkness of tyranny. The terrorists wanted to extinguish that light, and they still do. So Canadians stand with you, not merely because we're friends and neighbors, but because when you were attacked for your love of freedom, so were we. We're an independent country, but we thank you and love you for being the world's lighthouse. I observed this morning's official ceremonies at Ground Zero, and in many ways, it was beautiful and appropriate. The fountains at the plaza are visually powerful, and the rebuilding of the towers finally is a sign of hope. Reading the names of the murder victims was touching and a powerful moment for their families and friends, I'm sure. But it's not enough merely to remember the dead and to grieve. We must remember why these men and women were killed, why it was so profoundly evil that they were, why we cannot let this stand, and what we're going to do about it. The central characteristic of 9/11 was not the loss of life. It was that the loss of life was the result of a human purpose. It was not a tragic accident or a natural disaster, nor was it just a crime. It was a horrendous act of terror motivated by evil ideas. Peaceful fountains and a list of names is not enough for the victims of a global terrorist war against freedom. It belittles their sacrifice merely to note their passing. We must remember why it happened, and remembering why compels us to keep fighting the war in which 9/11 was just one battle. 10 years later, that war is still not won. Our work is still not done. The world is not safe enough yet. Al-Qaeda itself may be weakened, but the forces of Islamic terrorism are on the march, from Iran to Egypt, and in attacks that continue against freedom-loving people from London to Madrid to Bali to Mumbai to Jerusalem. Instead of calling for victory, for a war for victory, though, today's official memorial aimed for a tone of closure. New York's mayor has said that we should no longer even say the words Ground Zero because that's in the past. The great heroes of 9/11, the police and firemen, were not allowed to participate today. They are symbols of courage and vigilance and strength, but they were pushed aside. No clergy were permitted either. Perhaps they talked too much about good and evil. The dead must be buried and we must grieve, and that has happened. But erasing from the public narrative any trace of the war on terror would be like holding a memorial at Pearl Harbor just 1 year later in December of 1942 and remembering the dead and their families, but not talking about the infamous attack, not calling for courage in the fight ahead, and not promising that the dead will be avenged and that freedom and peace will be won on our terms, and not naming Imperial Japan. It just doesn't make sense. I'm not here to talk about partisan politics. The instinct to avert one's eyes from evil is a universal human condition. It's not a Republican or a Democratic thing. 10 years of vigilance and war is tiring, but the fight is not done. It is a fight. It can't be compromised. Free people can't split the difference with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. You can't triangulate this. We've got to fight until we win. And that fight will have costs, and sometimes that cost will be high. The policemen and firemen who rushed into the burning towers knew that. Without a second thought, they were willing to sacrifice to save their fellow Americans. Thank God, to this day, millions of Americans continue to fight with marvelous courage and ingenuity to defeat Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and their other terrorist allies, either in the armed forces or in security and intelligence services, and even in the diplomatic corps. I'm proud to tell you that Canada has been a key ally in that fight, punching above our weight in Afghanistan and being a clear voice against terrorism and its excusers in the United Nations. But there are other ways that we must fight too, not just to honor the memory of those murdered on 9/11, but to protect ourselves and our families and communities and our freedom that's under attack. And the first way for those of us not in uniform to fight back is to fight for control over the language, including the language of 9/11. Today and each anniversary ought to be not a day of service and volunteerism. Those are noble things, but that's not what 9/11 is about. So we must make sure it is a day of proper and accurate memory. And that memory compels us to take action until we win, until 9/11 becomes a day to mark the beginning of our successful counterattack that started on Flight United 93, when freedom went, reluctantly as it always does, to war, and in that case, to a victory. We're not done yet. We haven't won yet. The other side knows that, and we ought to as well. Unlike many New Yorkers, I don't know anyone who was killed on 9/11, but just as much as you, I have an obligation to those who were killed not to walk away from the fight for freedom, not to get tired or just numb. I'm not a soldier, and most of you aren't either, but we can fight in the battle of ideas. That's our front line. Let's today promise each other we will not forget why these 3,000 souls were murdered, and we will not rest until their lives and the freedom they died for are avenged. Thank you, and God protect America and her allies.
I was very sad that day. I remember how hard it was to read that speech without tearing up. I don't think it actually showed, but in my mind, I remember that day, and I thought I was actually crying a bit in my speech. That's how I remember it, in my mind at least. That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.